We're focusing today on what can be a really challenging diagnostic area in gastroenterology, small bowel bleeding, specifically the assessment and the management. So we're aiming to give a very sharp overview of the clinical pathways you need to navigate this.
Exactly. And let's define that right away. Small bowel bleeding is very specific. It's when you have persistent or recurrent bleeding and your conventional scopes.
The upper endoscopy and the colonoscopy.
Right. Both of those have failed to find a source. So you're basically looking for a needle in a haystack.
So how often do you, as a clinician, actually run into this kind of diagnostic puzzle? Is it common?
It's not the most common, but you will see it. Small bowel bleeding accounts for about 5 to 10% of patients presenting with gastrointestinal bleeding.
Okay, so a minority.
A minority, yes, but it's one that is disproportionately complex and, frankly, resource-intensive to manage.
Okay, let's get into the culprits. When you've confirmed it's a small bowel issue, what are the most frequent causes that should be at the top of your list?
Well, the causes really depend heavily on the patient's age. So for your patients over 50, the primary driver is usually vascular.
Angiodysplasias.
Angiodysplasias, yes. Hands down the most common cause of small bowel bleeding across all demographics. They often account for, almost half the cases we end up finding.
That makes sense. We do see those a lot. But what about the non-vascular heavy hitters, the things clinicians really must identify?
So after that, you have to consider mass lesions. This means tumors.
Like what specifically?
Things like adenocarcinoma, stromal tumors, gastrointestinal stromal tumors and lymphomas. These are diagnoses you really want to catch early.
And what about things that look more like inflammation? Not neoplastic, not vascular.
Yes. The inflammatory causes are definitely on the list. You should be thinking about Crohn's disease, especially with deep ulcerations, or medication injury.
From NSAIDs.
Exactly. Injury from nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is often overlooked, but it's a major cause, particularly in older patients who are using these medications chronically.
Okay, now let's touch on the rare ones. The high-stakes diagnoses that are uncommon, but you really can't afford to miss.
So the rare but really important ones. Well, radiation enteropathy is one, especially if your patient has a history of pelvic radiation.
Okay.
Then there are congenital anomalies, like a Meckel diverticulum, which can bleed quite significantly. And you also look for a Dieulafoy lesion.
An abnormally large artery.
An abnormally large submucosal artery, right, that could just rupture. But the highest stakes one, the one you always have to have in the back of your mind, is the aortoenteric fistula.
That one is catastrophic. What makes that stand out? What are the clinical clues that you just cannot miss?
An aortoenteric fistula is the most serious cause. It's a direct connection between the aorta and the bowel. You usually see it in patients with prior aortic grafts. The bleeding is often massive.
Is there a warning sign?
Sometimes. The classic warning is a sentinel bleed, a small episode of bleeding that happens right before a massive, often fatal hemorrhage.
This just underscores how important patient stability is. So let's shift gears to workflow. A patient presents with rapid, severe bleeding. They're hemodynamically compromised. What's the immediate, non-negotiable step?
You skip endoscopy. For an unstable patient with a rapid hemorrhage, you just skip it. Time is everything. You move immediately to selective angiography.
And why angiography? What's its dual role in this scenario?
It's diagnostic and therapeutic. Its purpose is twofold. First, you identify the active bleeding site, and second, you achieve hemostasis right then and there through embolization of that bleeding vessel.
So you stop the bleed on the table?
You have to. Embolization is mandatory in that scenario because without that rapid control, the patient is just going to continue to decline.
Okay, that's a very clear pathway for an unstable patient. Now, what about someone who's bleeding rapidly, maybe needing transfusions, but you can get them stable for a bit? What's the imaging for them?
If you can stabilize them, but the bleeding is still quite rapid, you choose between computed tomography angiography, a CTA, or a tagged red blood cell scan.
And is one better than the other?
Well, the CT angiogram is often preferred. It's fast, gives you great anatomical detail, and it can detect bleeding rates as low as 0.3 milliliters per minute.
And the tagged red blood cell scan?
That one is a bit more sensitive, technically, needing rates around 0.1 milliliters per minute. But its real advantage is that it can monitor for intermittent bleeding over several hours.
So there's a trade-off.
There is. But the CT scan is often the first choice because it gives you that anatomical map you need for whatever intervention comes next.
Now let's talk about the completely stable patient. The bleeding is chronic, recurrent, maybe occult. What has to be done before you even start thinking about the small bowel?
If the patient is stable, Conventional upper and lower endoscopy must be performed first, and they must be negative. It's a critical gateway.
And what if they keep coming in with melena?
Good point.
Yeah.
If the patient presents with recurrent melena, you should seriously consider a second look upper endoscopy. You want to be absolutely sure a high-lying duodenal ulcer or some other proximal lesion wasn't missed the first time.
Okay, so conventional scopes are negative. Now we can finally move into the small bowel. For that stable patient, what's the test of choice now?
Video capsule endoscopy. It's really the standard of care for this situation. It's non-invasive, and it gives you a visual survey of the entire small bowel mucosa.
It sounds great in theory, but what's the actual success rate? I've seen some very wide ranges for its diagnostic yield.
You're right, the range is wide. The diagnostic yield for video capsule endoscopy goes from about 38% up to 83%.
That's a huge variation. Why?
It reflects different patient populations, how acute the bleeding is, and frankly, the skill of the person interpreting the study. The takeaway is that while it's effective, it is not a guaranteed diagnosis.
And what are the biggest limitations, the frustrations that practitioners run into with the capsule?
The limitations are pretty significant. First, the interpretation isn't real-time. You have to wait for the download. Second, it's terrible at localization.
It gives you a picture, but not a map.
Exactly. It tells you what, but not really where. You're just estimating based on transit time. And maybe the most significant drawback,
You can't do anything.
you can't do anything about it. It is purely diagnostic. So you find a bleeding source, and now you have to schedule an entirely separate procedure to treat it. This just prolongs the time to a definitive therapy.
Not to mention false positives and negatives.
Of course. It can miss things, and it can also identify a little red spot that turns out to be nothing.
So that inability to treat is the gap that the next set of tools had to fill. If the capsule or other imaging confirms a source, how do we move from diagnosis to therapy?
The therapeutic step is deep enteroscopy. This is the technology that really changed the game for small bowel bleeding management. We're talking about balloon-assisted enteroscopy or spiral enteroscopy.
And these let you get deep into the small bowel?
Very deep. These methods let us reach almost the entire small bowel.
How far can you actually go with, say, a balloon-assisted scope?
Depending on whether you go from the mouth antegrade or from the rectum retrograde, you can achieve visualization of up to 90% of the small intestine.
Which is incredible.
It is. The ability to scope, locate, and treat all in the same session is what makes it so powerful.
But deep enteroscopy isn't a simple procedure. When would you be justified in using it first line, skipping the capsule endoscopy altogether?
There are definitely clear situations for that. If you have a very high suspicion of a proximal lesion, say in the jejunum, you might go straight to an antegrade scope.
Okay.
You also skip the capsule if the patient has altered anatomy, maybe a prior gastrectomy or a Roux-en-Y reconstruction where the capsule might not pass correctly, or of course, if it's medically contraindicated.
And what if you suspect the bleeding is way at the end of the line in the ileum?
Yeah, if you suspect bleeding specifically in the distal ileum, the retrograde approach is often better. You would consider a retrograde balloon enteroscopy for more direct access.
Now, you said it's powerful, but it's not routine. Does it carry significantly higher risks than, say, a standard colonoscopy?
Oh, absolutely. We have to be very clear about this. Deep enteroscopy is associated with a higher degree of morbidity and complications.
Such as?
The procedure time is long, and the physical stress of advancing the scope that far increases the risk of pancreatitis, especially with the antegrade approach, and also potential perforation. It demands experienced personnel and very careful patient selection.
Let's circle back to imaging for a moment. What if the video capsule is negative, but you're still highly suspicious? Or you think there might be an obstruction? What's the next imaging step?
If the capsule is negative, or if you're looking for something in the wall of the bowel that the capsule might miss, you move to high-quality cross-sectional imaging.
So a CT or MR enterography.
That's right. Computed tomography enterography or magnetic resonance enterography.
And what are you looking for with those that the capsule couldn't show you?
You're looking for structural disease. Things like masses, strictures, or inflammatory changes in the bowel wall or even the mesentery. The capsule shows you the mucosa. The CT or MR shows you the entire wall and everything around it. It's vital for finding tumors or significant Crohn's disease.
So with all these advances, the capsule for localization, deep enteroscopy for treatment, when does surgery become necessary?
Surgical intervention is infrequent now, but its indications are absolute. You need surgery if endoscopic attempts to control active bleeding have failed repeatedly.
And that would involve what, a resection?
Often a surgical resection of the bleeding segment, yeah. Sometimes it's guided by intraoperative enteroscopy to pinpoint the location.
Are there any diagnoses that just automatically mean a trip to the operating room?
Yes, certain causes require surgery up front. Any bleeding cancer that you can't remove endoscopically has to be resected. And as we discussed, that aortoenteric fistula requires immediate surgical repair, no question. Also, if the patient has simultaneous surgical emergencies like peritonitis or an obstruction, then surgery obviously becomes the primary path.
This has been a really systematic walkthrough. You stabilize a patient, you use conventional scopes, then the video capsule for stable patients, and finally, deep enteroscopy for therapy.
Right. And what's really fascinating here is how this pathway has evolved. With endoscopic therapy being so effective now, the really critical decision point for you as a clinician is the timing of the surgical consult.
Because you don't need it as often.
You don't. Surgical treatment for GI bleeding is infrequent. But, and this is the key thought, recognizing those specific, infrequent indications where it is absolutely mandatory. The cancer, the complex stricture, the aortoenteric fistula, that remains essential for rapid and safe management. You have to recognize those situations every single time.